Danie, thanks for coming. This is the very first sequence that we're going to do for discipline-specific repositories. And thank you for being the first to try this out with us. I'm Shelley Stahl from the American Geophysical Union. I'm our Vice President for Open Science Leadership. And we are really focused on how to highlight the different types of domain discipline-specific repositories. And I'm here with Danie Kinkade. Danie, would you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Thanks so much first for the opportunity, Shelley. I really appreciate it. My name is Danie Kinkade. I am the director and co-PI of the Biological and Chemical Oceanography Data Management Office, or BCO-DMO, which is physically sits at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution.
Fantastic. Thank you. So one of the reasons we find discipline-specific repositories so desirable for depositing data is that you provide services for researchers in order to make sure that data is as reusable as possible. This is what I'd like to talk about. So the process, can you talk about like when a researcher reaches out to you, can you do just a real quick short version of what that process looks like?
Sure. Well, so disciplinary repositories offer a wide array of services. And for our repository serving the oceanographic community, primarily within the National Science Foundation's awardees, we start working with principal investigators as early as their proposal stage. So we can offer help on crafting a data management plan, helping them understand the types of data that they'll need to take, where those data would best be curated. And then when it's time for them to start collecting data, we can help them in formatting and their own personal laboratory data management. And then when it comes time for them to share and submit with us, we help them decide on the best orientation and organization of that data. We help them craft and we assemble copious amounts of contextual metadata. We reformat as necessary, do quality control. We basically make an end product data set that is as fair as possible for reuse by a wide audience, from researchers to non-experts, the general public.
So you make it as easy as possible on the researcher. You really take that burden on for making the data fair.
Absolutely. I think that, even in our current climate, research is challenging, and researchers are not educated in either personal data management, but also how to understand the processes necessary to make those data reusable down the road. And so we lift a lot of the burden in data sharing off of the researcher, basically.
So let's kind of look behind the curtain. One of the things that you and I've talked about is the staff that you've had for 10, 15, 20 years who have done this curation. These are skilled folks.
They are very skilled folks. Pretty much everyone on the BCO-DMO team is trained to a master's level in oceanographic domains or environment-related sciences. We have a couple of PhD level staff who are really interested in, this is their passion to work on this type of challenge and in this data space. And they've all been out to sea. They all know the instrumentation. They know a lot of the disciplinary data. And so they're really in tune with this. They're also very skilled at reading the literature that's associated with those data in order to extract metadata for reuse of those data types. And then they have a large network. So where we have a gap in our knowledge base on a particular data type, we know who to reach out to get that expertise to help curate those data. They're very talented. They have both disciplinary background, and they also have the information sciences background that they've learned on, sort of on the ground.
So when you bring somebody new in, let's say, somebody retires or such, how long does it take to actually get them comfortable doing this work? I mean, that seems to me like it takes a little bit. It
does. It's significant. And, the disciplinary curation isn't for everyone. We have very complex workflows. We leverage a lot of sort of open source tools. So we try and make it as easy as possible, but oceanography is highly heterogeneous, and the data types that research produces are or widely, very widely. And so, it can take anywhere from 6 months to a year to have somebody feel comfortable in processing those data on their own without sort of some kind of assistance. And that's with a lot of automation on our side too. And we're trying to lessen that burden, but just learning the data types and what comes in, it's challenging, but it's a big spin up time for sure. We want the fidelity of those people, because we've invested so much in them. Yeah.
So one of the things that comes to mind is, so I one of the roles that I have is I'm on the board for the National Academies for Research, Data, and Innovation, and there's a real rhetoric right now on how do we professionalize data curators, data managers, because they're such a critical contributor to data sets being fair, being reusable. And it's like you're hitting those touch points really strongly. Like you have a little microcosm where you figured it out for your space, and the forces around you are not aligned yet to recognize that. How do you keep the morale up? That must be hard for everybody.
It is. It's incredibly challenging. I will say that it's taken years to craft the team that we have now. And I will also say that we try and provide every opportunity for our staff to continually train in skill based, because it is an evolving science. Information science is rapidly evolving with technology. So we allow them to just take the training that they need. And I will say that we've amassed this team with both disciplinary expertise, but also information science expertise as well. Like, so we'll have somebody who has, gone back for a master's in library science in addition to their master's in oceanography. And we try and give people opportunities to have side projects that allow them to kind of expand their knowledge base, keep training, and give a rest from the day in and day out of data processing, because there is a steady stream of research output coming our way all the time. So it's a balance, definitely.
So we made a requirement at with our AGU journals, and you were part of the project that helped bring this along. That data has to be cited within all of our publications. So just this year, we've reached 95%. So 95% of all the papers are, yay. But that increased your work. We sent more authors to you, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. The workload at a disciplinary repository, and we're not alone in this. I mean, it's certainly a wonderful thing to see that the data are coming in, but the data are coming in. And so that's a challenge too. It definitely increased our workload, and our budgets are not expanding commensurate to the workload, obviously. So that's a big challenge too, keeping morale up in that sense, because it has stepped up. And there was an interesting blip during COVID that we saw in data submissions too, because people couldn't go out into the field to do their research. So everything that people were sort of sitting on that hadn't been processed, they were publishing still during COVID, but they were processing data. And so we have seen sort of a steady increase since that time, and we're still experiencing it. It's definitely a challenge for
your stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. It's challenging.
And so for the folks that don't have a sense for how you're funded, how many years do you get funding for at a time?
Yeah, we're on a 5-year cycle with the National Science Foundation, and I think that's pretty standard in the geosciences for most of the infrastructure. And we're fairly unique in that we're funded out of a disciplinary science domain. And so, there's this juxtaposition for NSF to balance the need for cyber infrastructure that curates the data that's getting produced versus the science that they could be.
So, and the reason I really am keen about this, and it's something that AGU that I'm working on this year, and kind of a heads up to you, for those publications I mentioned, where there's 95% that are having data citations, more than 70% of those data sets are being driven to generalist repositories, and I am certain that's not the right place for all of them. Generalist repositories are great, but the data that should be in BCO-DMO needs to be redirected to BCO-DMO. And so if I'm successful this year, if you and the oceanographic community are supportive of this work, we'll be able to push even more work towards you. And I guess I'm giving you a heads up that maybe even in a few months, we might be able to get even more coming your direction. So what does that mean to you? Like, how do you prepare for that?
That's a great question, because we are in this constrained funding cycle, right? So once we're set in place, we have a really challenging time mitigating those types of risks, right? So, it falls on the burden of the grant administrators to sort of seek out alternative options for funding. But then that means that, funding or sustaining cyber infrastructure for information management is a challenge. And it's often the last thing that people want to think about, on the research side. What we do for the National Science Foundation is we've sort of taken care of the economy of scale for them. So rather than individual researchers having to pay out of each grant, our repository takes care of the whole funded corpus. And by doing that, we've reduced the cost per data set to manage that in a disciplinary repository. But as more data comes in, that's going to be a challenge to figure out how we provide the same level of curation to get to that fair data product in a constrained budgetary environment. Yeah.
So one more question.
Yeah. I take comfort in knowing we're not the only ones struggling with this, but at the same time, it's really a big problem. If we're expecting those data to be fair, we're going to have to invest in the infrastructure to make it so.
That's true. And something to keep in mind in other conversations that I'm having, specifically within publishers, they're really struggling with what does it mean to have peer-reviewed data. And one of my observations, and I'm hearing it coming out of the work in the European Commission, I'm hearing it come out of other countries, is if we can make data fair, that is a proxy, that is a substitute for peer-reviewed data. It's not exactly the same, but it's one possible way of looking at it, such that you could trust that data set more than you could something that maybe lands in a generalist repository with no metadata and no view. So we're actually pushing for that level of scrutiny at a publisher side, because we want to be able to say to, like, for instance, you are now contributing to the scientific record. Like, for every data set that's connected to an AGU journal article, we're counting on you as contributing to the scientific record through the deposit and preservation and DOI. So what does that mean? And you're answering that question. You're like the example of creating aligned, interoperable data that has the highest potential for reuse. And yet we're not, like, you don't have a way to mitigate your risks. So this is like, we need to think this through.
It is very much an moment. Yeah. Yeah. I think that, the wonderful thing about the strategy that we've taken with BCO-DMO is that it does, we have a lot of disciplinary expertise on the project already. And so there are very few gaps in where we would look towards something like peer review, but we do quality control, and we are working toward automating a lot of the using the tools already in the community that the researchers use to quality control their data, that we can pull that onto the repository side for content that hasn't been curated in that way, quality controlling at the observational level by the time we get it. And that's, again, there's a wide gamut of quality of data that comes into the repository. Some very, very high quality, and then others we try to bring up to that sort of that standard level. And it's a big effort. It's a big lift for sure. Yeah. And it is an moment. How do we sustain this and still provide the value, of that curation level?
So the next question I have, you deal with complexity, researchers deal with complexity. We know that the work that's done does not get easier. It doesn't get simpler. It gets harder. And that brings to you like an entire project's worth of data potentially.
Yes.
So you have some expertise in some areas. Can you talk about like one researcher complained to me, I have to put my data in different places. And I said, yes, isn't that wonderful? They said, no, it's in different places. Can you talk about that challenge and how BCO-DMO addresses that?
Sure. So oceanography is a great example for this. A researcher will go out to sea on a research vessel and do their work, and their work may generate several different data types, and there may be disciplinary repositories where those data are best served for the curation that needs to happen for those data, and the omics community, the sort of broadly encompassing genomics and proteomics, metabolomics, all of these data types have specialized repositories. So when that individual comes off the cruise with their data, it may get scattered in a bunch of different repositories. And that's a heavy lift. I mean, the researchers have to deal with different cultural norms of each repository that they have to submit to. There's different metadata templates and forms. They have to format the data, according to each repository. And so it takes a lot of time for them. And that data does get curated distributedly. And so how can we, as repository infrastructure, pull those data back together to see a holistic picture of the research that went on and give all the contextual components, and not send people doing that in their own, right? Because that's a challenge too. And one of the things that BCO-DMO has been doing is relying on the existing infrastructure of distributed resources and the capabilities of those resources. For example, leveraging persistent identifiers. When those data are tagged with persistent identifiers, repository infrastructure can easily pull those in and enable discovery and access from a central location. So my repository will leverage the accession numbers of a genome sitting in an NIH repository and be able to tie them to the metadata of the contextual cruise data that is necessary to interpret those genomic sequences. And we can allow the discovery by leveraging the PIDs, the persistent identifiers that are created at that other repository. So we'll link them to the data, to the cruise data that has all the information about the water column from where those samples were taken. And we can link them in a one-way discovery to all the other data sources. So it does two things. It aids the researcher who comes to find something related to the data we have, but it also provides a holistic picture of the project's goals and objectives and the outcomes.
Wow. One place, all the support a researcher needs.
Hopefully, yeah.
And how big is your researcher community? Do you have a sense for how many researchers use your
that is a great question. That's hard. That's a challenge. Several, thousands of people, but it's a broad community. It's the researcher that is the lead on the PI. It's their technical people who might touch the data. It's the students who might submit the data. There are hundreds of people involved in the data process, and we work with all of them. We have very tight relationships to process those data because we need to ask questions like, did you mean to take this particular observation in this precision because the community norm is something different? Do you want us to approach this? Do you want us to tackle this? And so there's a lot of dialogue that goes on to make each data set fair. And it's in that entire research chain from maybe a student to the technicians to the collaborators at the PI level. So it's a broad network, which is really nice because we get a lot of feedback on their needs and also, on how to streamline the process to the degree that we're capable of, in the budget constrained environment that we're in. But yeah.
So it's really a relationship, like Like
It
you have
definitely is.
researchers that come back every single time. And do you find that the second time and the third time they come, they it's a little bit more rote. They're able to provide a little bit more easily. Is there value in that? I mean, do they see do they get trained? Like, or do you still have to walk them through?
You know, to the degree that oh, so that there's an expected trend, right? So there are a lot of senior career researchers who are saying this is the way I've always done it and this works for me. And you know, things might be challenging. Offering a new feature in an online tool might be challenging, but um and we're asking our community to grow with us, right? So, you know, as technology changes, we have to ask more of them. And and for example, we've just created an online data submission tool. And, you know, getting people on board and adopting this when they're used to just sending files in an email to somebody, you know, that's just no longer scalable because, you know, of what you're talking about, this this continuing increase in data coming in. They just can't come in an email to a repository. That's not scalable. We can't track all that. And so as we build these more robust systems, we're asking the researchers to come along with us. And ultimately, we hope it helps them. But, you know, that's its own ballet in changing culture and asking them to be a little more data savvy when they have no training background. I will say that the early career researchers are they're much more adept at new challenges in the data space. You know, they're more data savvy, but certainly still not trained. There's no formal education for for a graduate student in oceanography for data management. Those are very few and far between. They're just starting to hit sort of curriculum as, hey, we should be paying attention to this. And this year, myself and a colleague at the Oceanographic here hosted a data savvy oceanographer course, and small dipping their toes in. It was a small class size, but they were all very grateful. The reviews were wonderful, and they all worked on their own dissertation data. And so they've made their own data fair in the process of this course. And so that was really nice. When they finally go to deposit their dissertation data, it will be all ready to go. And they were all incredibly thankful. The reviews were wild, but it's not the norm, right?
No, it's not the norm. And I think, so what I'm hearing you say is as you get more researchers submitting data, you have to figure out ways to streamline how submissions come to you to reduce or figure out how to have a higher capacity with the team that is budget bound. And you're pushing more responsibility to the researcher in order to accommodate, which
That's
may
right.
or may not be what the community actually wants. The
That's right.
community may actually want support, full concierge support. So it's a
That's
real
fair.
balance you're
I
working.
love that.
Yeah.
Concierge support. That's right. But they also don't have the capacity right now either, right? That curriculum isn't standardized for the oceanographic community. And I can't speak to the other geosciences, but I suspect it's the same. So they don't have those skill sets yet. And yet we're pushing them back to say, hey, you know, you need to take a look at your observational data. You need to think about crafting an abstract for a data set, not your entire paper, right? You need to, so we're trying to change this culture of thinking about data publication, but really it's it's a slow process and they don't have the skills underneath them. So it's an education process while it's a culture change process. And that needs to happen because of that budget constraint, right? I mean, it's just,
There's
yeah.
no other,
There's
and
no
you're
other
not
way
the
right
only one.
now.
You're
Yeah.
not the only ones trying to do that.
Right,
So
right. I think this is the same case, you know, if you were to speak to somebody in geology or you were to speak to somebody and, you know, I think perhaps the health sciences are maybe a little more farther along in this chain of, you know, sort of data savviness, but certainly
I'm
the
not sure they would
geosciences
say.
struggle. Yeah.
So this is the end of our time. Danie, thanks so much.
Yeah,
I've
thanks
learned a
again for
lot.
the opportunity.
And I hope we have a lot more in our series talking to the discipline-specific repositories. So have a wonderful day, and thanks again.
Thanks so much, Shelley.